The radio exploded in my ear before I even saw the fight. Contact left, we're pinned. Ramirez, we need eyes now. Dust rolled across the valley like a storm as I dropped behind my rifle on the ridge. Through my scope, the world snapped into sharp focus. Muzzle flashes ripping across the ravine, tracer rounds cutting the air, and a shattered convoy truck burning at the bottom of the valley. Behind that wreckage, seven Navy SEALs were fighting for their lives. They were trapped in a bowl of rock with enemy fire pouring down from both ridges above them. Fighters were moving through the cliffs like shadows, closing in from every direction. Every path out of the ravine was already covered. My name is Sergeant Elena Ramirez, U.S. Marine Corps Scout Sniper attached to a joint Navy SEAL task unit, and at that moment I was the only overwatch they had left. My position sat nearly 2,000 meters above the battlefield on a narrow ridge, the wind tearing sideways through the rocks. Even for a long rifle, the distance was brutal. Through the scope, I found the man controlling the ambush. He stood farther up the valley behind a jagged rock wall, barely exposing himself as he directed the fighters below like a commander moving pieces across a chessboard. Every time he raised his arm, another wave of gunfire crashed down on the SEALs. If he gave the final signal, those 7 men wouldn't survive the next minute. My spotter shifted beside me, voice tight and low. Ramirez, target just stepped out. For a heartbeat, the commander moved clear of the rock wall. The wind scraped across my rifle barrel. Dust drifted through the scope. My breathing slowed to a single steady rhythm. Because there was only one truth in that moment. For 3 seconds sashed, the man running the ambush stood fully exposed in my crosshairs. And if I missed, 7 Americans would die in that valley. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Lady Veteran Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? 6 hours earlier, the valley had been quiet enough that you could hear the wind scraping across the stone. That alone should have warned us. My name is Sergeant Elena Ramirez, Marine Corps Scout Sniper attached to a Joint Special Operations Patrol operating along the eastern edge of the Spingar Mountains. Our unit had been tracking weapons movements through the region for weeks, and the intelligence finally gave us a clean target, a militant logistics convoy scheduled to pass through a narrow valley before sunset. The team on the ground belonged to Lieutenant Marcus Hale, a Navy SEAL officer with the kind of calm authority that never needed to be announced. Hale wasn't loud, and he didn't waste words. When he spoke over the radio, every man in the unit listened. His team had worked together long enough that they moved like parts of the same machine. Chief Grant Walker, the team sniper, carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent half his career behind a rifle. Tyler Dalton, the medic, had a quiet sense of humor that showed up in the worst moments. Adrian Torres handled communications and surveillance systems, constantly scanning equipment screens even while walking. Kyle Miller, the breacher, had shoulders like a door frame and the patience of a bomb technician. 2 additional operators rounded out the patrol, both experienced enough that introductions weren't necessary. You could tell a lot about soldiers by the way they checked their gear before stepping off. These men checked everything twice. Our mission looked simple on paper. Intercept the convoy moving weapons through the valley. Secure the cargo. Capture the militant commander rumored to be traveling with it. But the name attached to the operation made every experienced operator uneasy. The enemy strategist behind the convoy was known only as the architect. No confirmed photo. No confirmed identity. Just a reputation. Every attack attributed to him followed the same pattern. Carefully constructed ambush zones, overlapping fields of fire, escape routes sealed before the first shot was fired. He didn't just fight battles, he designed them. Because of that reputation, Hale positioned me and my spotter high above the valley on a ridge overlooking the entire convoy route. From that elevation, my rifle could cover nearly the entire approach road. The ridge was brutal terrain. Loose rock, steep angles, and wind that shifted direction every few seconds as it bounced between the mountain walls. The valley below twisted like a cracked spine with cliffs and narrow choke points that made vehicle movement predictable. Perfect terrain for an interception or an ambush. For the first hour, everything looked normal. The sun was dropping toward the mountains, painting the rocks in long shadows. Through the scope, I scanned ridge lines, dry creek beds, and broken cliff edges. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Movement. Not obvious movement. Just small shapes shifting along the distant ridges. At first I thought it was animals. Then I adjusted the scope magnification. The shapes were too still, too deliberate. I lowered my voice and spoke to my spotter. Check the east ridge. Halfway up the slope. He raised his binoculars and stayed silent for several seconds. Then he exhaled slowly. I see them. How many? He kept scanning. Hard to tell, but at least 15 firing positions. That number didn't make sense. A convoy escort wouldn't need that many hidden positions. The road below was already narrow and exposed, which meant those fighters weren't protecting the convoy. They were waiting for something. I radioed Lieutenant Hale quietly. Possible movement on the ridge lines could be overwatch positions. Hale answered immediately. Copy. Keep eyes on. His team continued moving toward the intercept point along the valley road. The convoy had not yet arrived, and there was no confirmation that the shapes we saw were enemy fighters. For several minutes, the valley fell silent again. Then dust appeared on the horizon. Vehicles approaching. Through the scope, I counted them. One truck, then another behind it, then two more following close together. Exactly the number intelligence predicted. The convoy rolled into the valley slowly, engines echoing between the cliffs. Below me, Hale's team moved into position along the road, hidden among rocks and scrub brush. Grant Walker positioned his rifle beside a boulder, covering the lead vehicle. For a few seconds, everything felt controlled again, planned, predictable. The lead truck reached the narrowest section of the valley. Then the road disappeared in fire. A massive explosion lifted the vehicle off the ground and flipped it sideways across the road. The shockwave slammed through the valley like thunder. Before the dust even settled, gunfire erupted from both ridges. Machine guns, automatic rifles, rockets screaming down into the kill zone. The SEAL team dove behind the burning wreckage as bullets ripped through the rocks around them. And in that instant, watching the entire battlefield through my scope, I understood exactly what had happened. The convoy was never the objective. Within seconds, I realized the horrifying truth. The convoy was bait, and the SEAL team had just driven straight into the architect's trap. The explosion rolled through the valley like thunder, tearing the earth open. Through my scope, I watched the lead convoy truck lift off the road, spin sideways, and crash down in a storm of dust and shattered metal. The blast scattered debris across the narrow pass, instantly sealing the road. Contact! Contact! Ambush! Lieutenant Hale's voice cracked across the radio as gunfire erupted from both sides of the valley. Enemy fighters opened up from the ridges above like floodgates bursting open. Long bursts from machine guns stitched the ground around the SEAL team. Tracer rounds cut glowing lines through the dusty air, ricocheting off rocks and shattered concrete. Rockets screamed down from the cliffs. One slammed into the hillside just meters from Hale's position, sending shards of stone flying through the air. The SEALs moved instantly, diving behind the overturned convoy truck and scattered boulders for cover. Even under that kind of fire, they stayed controlled, disciplined, returning shots with short, precise bursts. But they were trapped. The valley floor was a bowl of rock and dirt, and the enemy had the high ground on both sides. A perfect kill zone. Grant Walker slid into position behind a boulder and raised his rifle, trying to counter the enemy shooters on the ridge. Through my scope, I saw him line up a shot, then jerk backward as machine gun fire shredded the rock in front of him. "Snipers suppressed!" someone shouted over the radio. More militants began appearing from places that hadn't even looked like hiding spots minutes earlier, from behind jagged rock formations, from narrow cracks in the cliffs, even from what looked like small cave openings carved into the mountainside. They moved quickly, spreading out along the ridges and pouring fire down into the valley. My spotter exhaled slowly beside me. They built this whole thing. He was right. This wasn't a random ambush. Every firing position had been chosen in advance. Every angle covered. The SEAL team was caught in overlapping lines of fire that made movement nearly impossible. Over the radio, Lieutenant Hale's voice cut through the chaos. "We're pinned. Negative movement. Multiple enemy positions on both ridges." Gunfire exploded again, louder this time. Another rocket struck near the convoy wreckage, blasting dirt and shrapnel across the valley floor. Through my scope, I saw Medic Tyler Dalton dragging one of the operators behind thicker cover while bullets cracked through the air above them. But the enemy wasn't rushing them yet. They were holding position, containing the trap. That meant someone was controlling the fight. I began scanning the far ridges carefully, sweeping my scope across every cliff edge and rock formation. Then I saw him, far up the valley, standing on a narrow shelf of stone nearly 2 kilometers away. At first he looked like just another fighter, but he wasn't firing. He was watching and directing. He raised one arm and pointed toward the valley floor. Immediately, 3 enemy fighters shifted position along the ridge, opening fire from a new angle. A few seconds later, he gestured again. Another group moved along the cliff edge, tightening the crossfire around the trapped seals. The coordination was too precise to be coincidence. My spotter followed my scope. "You see him?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's the architect." The man stood calmly behind a jagged rock barrier that shielded most of his body. Only his upper torso appeared when he leaned forward to observe the battlefield. Every movement he made changed the rhythm of the fight. When he raised his hand, fighters advanced. When he lowered it, they shifted firing lanes. He wasn't just part of the ambush. He was conducting it. Like a battlefield orchestra, my spotter adjusted his binoculars and started calculating. Distance, 1,980 meters. He paused. Almost 2 clicks. That distance pushed the edge of most sniper engagements. Even with my rifle, the bullet would drop dramatically before reaching the target. Wind drift alone could throw the shot off by several feet. But it was still technically possible. The bigger problem was the rock wall. The architect rarely stepped fully into the open. Most of the time, only a fraction of his body appeared above the stone. And every time he shifted position, the angle disappeared again. Below us, the firefight continued to intensify. Grant Walker managed to drop one fighter along the ridge, but another immediately filled the position. Hale's voice returned to the radio, tighter now. "Enemy numbers increasing, we cannot maneuver. Repeat, we are pinned." My spotter looked back at the distant commander. "Ramirez, that guy is running the whole battle." I already knew, because every time the architect lifted his arm, the enemy lines adjusted like clockwork, and every adjustment tightened the noose around the SEAL team in the valley. I steadied my breathing and kept the scope on him, because the truth was becoming painfully clear. If that man stayed alive, this ambush would not end. The fighters would keep pressing the trap until ammunition ran out, until the SEALs ran out of places to hide, until the valley floor became a graveyard. And watching the fight unfold through my rifle scope, I realized something that made the weight of the moment settle in my chest. If the architect stayed alive, the ambush would continue until every SEAL in that valley was dead. The battle in the valley didn't slow down. It got worse. Gunfire rolled constantly between the cliffs now, echoing through the narrow pass like thunder trapped between stone walls. Through my scope, I could see fighters spreading along the ridges, filling every firing position the architect had prepared for them. What started as a coordinated ambush was turning into a tightening cage. Down below, Lieutenant Hale's team was still holding their position behind the burning convoy wreckage. The overturned truck and scattered rocks gave them just enough cover to survive, but barely. Every time one SEAL leaned out to fire, 3 enemy rifles answered. Then I saw something that made my grip tighten on the rifle. Medic Tyler Dalton was crawling across the dirt toward one of the operators who had taken a hit during the rocket strike. Dalton moved fast but careful, keeping low as bullets cracked into the ground around him. He reached the wounded man and started working immediately. Then a burst of gunfire ripped across the valley floor. Dalton jerked sideways. Through the scope, I saw him drop behind the wreckage, clutching his shoulder. "Medic hit," someone shouted over the radio. The voice that followed was Torres, the communications specialist. "We're running low on ammo." "Hale, we can't keep this up." The valley was becoming a storm of noise, rifles snapping, machine guns hammering, rocks exploding under incoming fire. Even with their training and discipline, the SEALs were losing ground inch by inch. Grant Walker, the team sniper, tried to break the stalemate. I saw him slide away from the wreckage toward a cluster of rocks that gave him a better angle up the valley. If he could get eyes on the architect, maybe he could end the ambush himself. But the enemy had already anticipated that move. The moment Grant raised his rifle, a heavy machine gun opened up from the ridge. The rocks around him shattered under the impact, forcing him to dive back behind cover. He barely made it. Lieutenant Hale's voice came over the radio again, sharper now. All elements collapse inward. Defensive circle. The order was immediate and clear. The SEALs pulled closer together behind the wreckage and nearby boulders, forming a tight defensive position where they could support each other with overlapping fields of fire. It was the kind of formation soldiers use when escape is no longer an option. They weren't maneuvering anymore. They were surviving. Through my scope, I counted enemy fighters along the ridges. 20, then 25. More figures were appearing from the caves and hidden cracks in the rock. The architect had positioned reserves deeper in the mountains, and now they were moving forward to tighten the trap. My spotter watched through his binoculars while quietly working numbers in his head. Distance 1,980 meters, he murmured. He pulled a small notebook from his vest and started calculating. At that range, the bullet drop is nearly 10 meters, he continued. Wind drift could push it another 3 or 4 feet if it shifts. I didn't answer, because I already knew what those numbers meant. At this distance, the shot wasn't just difficult, it was brutal. Even the smallest change in wind between the ridges could throw the bullet wide of the target, and the wind was constantly moving. A slow gust brushed across the ridge where we lay hidden, rattling the loose gravel round my elbows. Down in the valley, the air moved differently, swirling between the cliffs like invisible currents. That meant the bullet would travel through several different wind layers before reaching the target, each one capable of pushing it off course. My spotter exhaled slowly. We'll need a perfect window. But something else was changing. Movement appeared along the rocky slope below our ridge. I shifted the scope slightly and felt my chest tighten. Enemy fighters, 3 of them at first, then 5. They were climbing carefully along the rocks, using the terrain for cover as they moved upward toward our position. Someone down there had realized where the overwatch fire was coming from. Our ridge was no longer safe. Ramirez, my spotter said quietly, "We've got company." I saw them clearly now. Dark figures moving through the rocks, rifles slung low as they climbed. They weren't rushing, they were hunting, which meant we had limited time before they reached the top. I forced my attention back toward the valley, because the real danger wasn't climbing toward us. It was still standing nearly 2 kilometers away. The architect. Through the scope, I watched him step forward again behind the stone barrier overlooking the battlefield. His posture was calm, controlled, like a man watching a machine operate exactly as he designed it. Below him, the fighters along the ridge waited, and then he raised his arm. The signal. Several groups of militants shifted position immediately, moving toward the edges of the ridge above the trapped SEALs. If he gave the next command, they would rush the valley floor all at once. Dozens of fighters pouring down the cliffs in a final assault. 7 SEALs against an entire ambush force. Even warriors like Hale's team wouldn't survive that. My spotter lowered his binoculars slowly and looked at me. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, but the truth had already settled between us like a weight. Finally he spoke. "Ramirez, if that guy gives the order." He stopped for a moment, then finished the sentence quietly. "You're the only one who can stop him." And hearing it spoken made the reality impossible to ignore. My spotter had just said the words neither of us wanted to admit. I was the only person on the battlefield who could stop the architect. The moment my spotter said it out loud, the battlefield changed for me. Up until then, I had been observing the fight, watching the pieces move through the valley like a grim chessboard. But now the entire ambush narrowed to one simple truth. If the architect stayed alive, the SEAL team below would die. I shifted slightly behind the rifle and pulled it tighter into my shoulder. The wind brushed across the ridge again, tugging at the loose fabric of my sleeve and sending small grains of dust skittering across the stone. Nearly 2,000 meters. Even for a rifle built for distance, that was brutal territory. My spotter slid closer beside me, voice low and controlled as he began calling numbers. Range, 1,980 meters. I adjusted the elevation turret on the scope. Click, click, click. Wind left to right, 3 miles per hour, maybe 4. I watched the faint shimmer of dust drifting across the valley floor and made another adjustment. At that range, the bullet wouldn't travel in a straight line. It would arc through the air like a slow, invisible curve, climbing and then dropping toward the target. If the wind shifted even slightly along the way, the shot could miss by several feet. Altitude, temperature, air density, every detail mattered. My breathing slowed as the rifle settled against the rock. Through the scope, I kept the crosshairs centered on the distant ridge where the architect moved behind his stone barrier. Most of his body remained hidden. Only a shoulder or an arm appeared occasionally when he leaned forward to watch the battlefield. Below us, the fight continued to grind forward. Gunfire cracked through the valley like thunder. Dust clouds rolled across the rocks as rockets slammed into the ground around the trap seals. Grant Walker's voice suddenly burst through the radio. "Ramirez, if you can see their command element, take the shot." A burst of gunfire cut across the transmission before he finished speaking. Another voice followed Torres. "They're shifting positions on the ridge. Hale, they're preparing to push." Lieutenant Hale came back on the radio, calm but tight. "All stations hold. Defensive circle, no one breaks cover." But even through the static, I could hear the strain behind his voice. They were running out of options. A moment later, Grant spoke again, his breathing heavy. "We won't survive another assault wave." The words hung in the air. I tightened my focus through the scope. The architect leaned forward again, watching the chaos below like a man observing a battlefield map. Every few seconds he gestured toward different sections of the ridge, repositioning his fighters with cold precision. He was patient. He was waiting for the perfect moment to unleash the final attack. My spotter suddenly tapped my arm. Movement below us. I glanced away from the scope for a second and saw them, dark figures climbing through the rocks along the slope beneath our ridge. Enemy fighters. They were spreading out as they climbed, careful and deliberate, scanning the terrain as they moved. Someone had realized that overwatch fire was coming from above. "They're getting close," my spotter whispered. "How long?" "Maybe 5 minutes." That wasn't enough time to relocate. And even if we moved, the valley fight would end before we could find another angle. I forced my attention back through the scope, because none of that mattered if the architect gave the final signal. Through the magnified glass, I watched him step slightly away from the rock barrier. For a moment, he was only partially exposed. Then something changed. A fighter approached him from the side and spoke quickly. The architect turned his body to look farther down the valley, and for the first time since the battle started, he stepped completely clear of the stone. His entire upper body came into view. My spotter sucked in a breath. Target exposed. The wind drifted across the valley again. My crosshairs settled on the center of the man's chest. The range indicator glowed faintly inside the scope. 1,980 meters. The architect scanned the battlefield below, studying the trap SEAL team as if deciding when to end the fight. He wouldn't stay exposed long. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. My spotter whispered the final wind call. 3.5 miles per hour, drifting right. I made the last tiny adjustment to the rifle. Below us, the SEAL team continued firing from behind the wreckage, their muzzle flashes blinking through the dust like distant lightning. 7 men fighting for their lives. All of it now balanced on a single decision. The rifle settled perfectly into my shoulder. The crosshairs stopped moving. And in that instant, a cold realization slid through my mind. If I hesitated, even for a single heartbeat, the architect would step back behind the rock wall. The window would vanish. The final assault would begin, and there would never be another shot. I steadied the rifle and realized something terrifying. If I hesitated even 1 second, the window would close forever. I forced the thought of hesitation out of my head and went back to the rifle. Everything now came down to preparation. At nearly 2,000 meters, a sniper shot stops being just about aim. It becomes mathematics, physics, and discipline fighting against chaos. I leaned closer to the scope and adjusted the elevation turret carefully. Click, click, click. Each tiny adjustment changed the rifle's angle by fractions of a degree, but at this distance, those fractions meant the difference between a perfect hit and a bullet disappearing somewhere into the mountains. My spotter stayed locked in the valley through his binoculars, reading the environment like a scientist watching a storm. "Wind layer 1, 3 miles per hour, right drift," he murmured. I adjusted slightly. "Wind layer 2, maybe 4, closer to the valley floor." Another tiny correction. Between us, the numbers began to form a picture of the invisible currents moving through the mountains. At extreme range, bullets don't just travel through air. They travel through different winds, different temperatures, different pressures, each one nudging the shot farther from its path. I steadied the rifle against the rock and rechecked the range. 1,980 meters. The shot was at the outer edge of what most snipers ever attempt in combat. But below us, the battle was reaching its breaking point. Through the scope, I saw Lieutenant Hale repositioning his team behind the shattered convoy truck. They had formed a tight defensive circle, rifles covering every approach while they waited for the next wave. Grant Walker was firing controlled shots toward the ridges, forcing enemy fighters to stay behind cover. Dalton, the wounded medic, was still moving, one arm pinned against his chest while he worked with the other. They were buying time, but not much. Torres's voice crackled over the radio again. Enemy movement on both ridges. They're preparing to push. Another burst of machine gun fire rattled across the valley floor. Rockets slammed into the rocks near the seals, sending clouds of dust rising into the air. The architect's plan was unfolding exactly the way he designed it. I shifted the scope slightly and found him again. He stood near the rock barrier, scanning the battlefield calmly, like a man watching a map unfold exactly as predicted. Then my spotter tapped my shoulder. "Ramirez, ridge below." I pulled back from the scope for a moment and looked down the slope beneath our position. The fighters climbing toward us were closer now, much closer. 5 of them are moving through the rocks, rifles ready, using the terrain to hide their advance. One of them stopped and scanned the ridgeline with binoculars. "They're hunting us," my spotter said quietly. "How long?" He watched their progress carefully. 3 minutes, maybe 4. That meant relocation was impossible. If we moved now, we would lose the shot completely, which meant the decision had already been made. I returned to the rifle and settled behind the scope again. The valley filled the lens. The burning convoy wreckage, the trapped SEAL team, the enemy fighters tightening the noose. And finally, the architect. He stepped forward again, raising one hand as he studied the battlefield. Fighters along the ridge shifted position the moment they saw the signal. Even from this distance, I could see the coordination in their movements. They were preparing. The final assault was seconds away. My spotter exhaled slowly beside me. "Wind correction, 2.8 right." I adjusted the rifle again, barely moving the turret. The crosshairs drifted across the valley until they settled on the architect's chest. For a moment he stood perfectly still, watching the valley below. Then he lifted his arm higher, the signal that would unleash the fighters. Below him, dozens of militants along the ridges, tense like a wave about to break. 7 SEALs were about to face the entire ambush force at once. My breathing slowed, one breath in, one breath out. The rifle felt heavier now, the weight of the moment settling into the stock pressed against my shoulder. Dust moved through the valley in thin drifting lines, revealing the wind currents that would shape the bullet's path. My spotter leaned closer and whispered the final correction. 2.5 right drift. I made the last adjustment. The crosshairs stopped moving. Through the scope, the architect's arm continued rising, preparing to give the command that would end the battle. The moment had finally arrived. My finger rested lightly on the trigger as the architect lifted his arm for the final assault order. The valley had become a storm of noise and smoke. Gunfire rolled through the mountains without pause now, echoing back and forth between the cliffs like thunder trapped inside stone walls. Dust drifted across the battlefield in long gray sheets, stirred by explosions and the constant hammer of machine guns. But up on the ridge, where my spotter and I lay behind the rifle, everything suddenly felt slower, quieter, more focused. I forced myself to ignore the chaos below and kept my eye locked through the scope. The crosshairs rested on the distant ridge where the architect stood directing the ambush. Even with the magnification turned high, he looked small at this distance, just a dark figure against pale stone nearly 2 kilometers away. But that small figure controlled everything happening in the valley. Below him, the enemy fighters were shifting again. More militants were climbing down from the ridges now. spreading out along the cliffs as they prepared to descend toward the trapped SEAL team. It was the final phase of the ambush, the moment when the enemy stopped containing the trap and moved in to finish it. Through the scope, I watched Lieutenant Hale's team bracing behind the shattered convoy truck. Grant Walker fired another shot toward the ridge, forcing a militant to drop behind cover. Miller shifted to a new position beside a boulder, launching a grenade that exploded halfway up the slope. But the enemy numbers were growing too fast. They were tightening the circle. Torres's voice cut across the radio again. "They're moving. Multiple fighters coming down the ridge." The sound of incoming fire exploded over the transmission. Then Lieutenant Hale came back on the radio. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "All stations, if anyone has a shot on command element, take it now." The words carried through the static like a final request. They knew. The SEAL team understood that the only way out of the valley was to break the chain of command controlling the ambush. My spotter shifted beside me, binoculars steady on the distant ridge. "Target still exposed," he whispered. I adjusted slightly behind the rifle, settling deeper into the stock. The crosshairs centered on the architect's chest. At this range, the reticle floated across the scope like a slow-moving ghost. Every tiny movement of my breathing translated into inches of motion across the valley. I slowed my breathing even further. In, out, in, out. The target shrank slightly as heat shimmer rose from the valley floor. Even through the glass, distance warped the image, bending the air between us like invisible water. My spotter kept watching the environment, wind holding 3 miles per hour. The architect stepped slightly forward again, scanning the battlefield below. Fighters along the ridge waited for his signal like wolves waiting for the pack leader's command. Behind him, the rock barrier still offered protection if he moved even a few inches, which meant the window for the shot remained razor thin. A sudden gust pushed across the valley. Dust lifted from the rocks and drifted through the air. The crosshairs shifted slightly. "Wind change," my spotter whispered quickly. "How much?" 3.8, drifting right. I adjusted the rifle just a fraction. The turret turned barely a click. At this distance, that single adjustment moved the impact point several feet across the valley. Below us, the firefight surged again. A rocket slammed into the ground beside the convoy wreckage, sending another cloud of dust exploding into the air. Through the haze, I could see the SEAL team holding their defensive circle, firing steadily as enemy fighters began descending from the ridges. They were seconds away from being overrun. My spotter exhaled slowly beside me. "Ramirez, fighters on the slope below are closing." I didn't look away from the scope, because if I did, the opportunity might vanish. Instead, I focused entirely on the distant figure framed in the glass. The architect, the man who had built the trap. He stood calmly on the ridge, watching the battlefield below like a general studying a map. Then he began raising his arm. The signal. All along the ridges, militants shifted forward, preparing to surge down into the valley. The final assault. 7 SEALs against an entire ambush force. My breathing slowed even more. The rifle felt perfectly balanced against the rock. The crosshairs settled exactly where they needed to be. My spotter whispered the final correction. "Wind steady, 3.5 right." I made the smallest adjustment possible. The reticle stopped drifting. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The valley, the dust, even the distant echoes of gunfire fading into the background. There was only the target. And the shot. The architect's arm rose higher, about to give the command that would end the fight. I let the air leave my lungs slowly. The rifle became perfectly still. And with 7 American lives hanging in the balance, I began the trigger squeeze that would decide the fate of the SEAL team below. The trigger broke like snapping glass. The rifle thundered against my shoulder, the recoil punching back into the rock beneath me. The sound rolled down the mountainside in a deep echo that bounced across the valley walls. Then everything went quiet. At that distance, the bullet took time to arrive. Nearly 2 kilometers of air stretched between my rifle and the man standing on the far ridge. For a fraction of a second, the world inside my scope looked frozen. The architect was still standing exactly where he had been, arm lifted, preparing to send his fighters into the valley. My spotter leaned closer, breath held. "Watch it." The bullet crossed the valley faster than sound, invisible, unstoppable. Then the impact came. Through the scope, I saw the architect jerk violently backward. His arm dropped instantly. His body collapsed against the rock behind him and disappeared from view. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. The fighters along the ridge seemed confused, their movements slowing as they searched for the signal that never came. The chain of command controlling the ambush had just vanished, and chaos rushed in to replace it. Two militants near the architect turned toward where he had fallen, shouting to each other. Others along the ridges hesitated, unsure whether to advance or hold position. That hesitation was all Lieutenant Hale needed. His voice exploded over the radio. "Break contact! Move left! Move now!" The SEAL team moved instantly. Grant Walker rolled out from behind the wrecked convoy truck and fired two rapid shots toward the ridge above them. One militant dropped from the cliff edge, while another dove for cover. Kyle Miller launched a grenade into a cluster of fighters descending the slope. The explosion blasted rocks and dust across the hillside, forcing the enemy back. "Push through!" Hale shouted. The SEALs surged toward the weakest section of the ambush line, the side that had been relying on the architect's commands moments earlier. Without those signals, the fighters there were disorganized and uncertain. The trap was breaking apart. From my position on the ridge, I watched the entire battlefield shift. Militants who had been moving confidently seconds before were suddenly shouting to each other, trying to regroup. Some fired wildly toward the valley floor, while others began pulling back toward the cliffs. The perfect ambush had just lost its architect. Grant and Miller covered the advance while the rest of the team sprinted from rock to rock across the valley floor. Hale reached a cluster of boulders halfway up the slope and turned, firing controlled bursts to keep the enemy pinned. "Move! Move!" Dalton, still wounded, staggered forward with one arm clutched against his chest while Torres helped pull him up the incline. Another rocket streaked across the valley but slammed harmlessly into the dirt behind them. The militants no longer had coordinated fire. They had lost the rhythm of the attack. Within seconds, the SEAL team broke through the line of fighters on the ridge and reached the higher ground. From there, the fight turned completely. Grant Walker dropped two more militants attempting to reorganize along the cliff. Miller fired another grenade that scattered a group of fighters trying to block the escape route. The remaining militants hesitated again, then began retreating. Some disappeared back into the caves and cracks along the mountainside. Others ran along the ridges, abandoning their firing positions and scrambling deeper into the mountains. The ambush had collapsed. My spotter finally exhaled beside me. "You got him," he said quietly. Below us, Hale's team regrouped along the ridge, rifles scanning the valley as the last shots echoed across the cliffs. Then Torres's voice came across the radio again. "Enemy retreating, multiple fighters breaking contact." A moment later, Hale answered, "Copy, secure high ground." The valley grew quieter with every passing second. Dust drifted slowly through the air where the firefight had raged minutes earlier. The burning wreckage of the convoy still smoldered on the road below, but the sound of gunfire had faded. Far in the distance, a new sound began to rise. The steady thumping of helicopter rotors. Extraction birds. Two dark shapes appeared over the mountains, sweeping low toward the valley now that the ambush threat had broken apart. The SEAL team signaled their position with colored smoke, the plume rising above the rocks as the helicopters circled down. From my ridge, I watched the entire scene unfold, the battlefield settling into silence after minutes of chaos. 7 men climbing aboard the aircraft. 7 men who, moments earlier, had been trapped in a perfect kill zone with no escape. My spotter glanced back toward the distant ridge where the architect had fallen. Then he looked at me. "One shot," he said. And he was right. 7 SEALs walked out of the kill zone alive because a single long-range shot shattered the ambush. The helicopters arrived just as the sun began climbing over the mountains. Their rotors thumped through the valley, cutting across the silence that had settled after the battle. Dust lifted from the ground in swirling clouds as the aircraft descended toward the ridge where the SEAL team had regrouped. From my position on the Overwatch ridge, I watched them move. The fight was over, but every one of them still moved like the battlefield might explode again at any moment. Rifles scanning the horizon, eyes checking every ridge and shadow. That's what training does. Even after survival, Your mind stays ready. Two medics jumped from the first helicopter as it touched down and rushed toward Tyler Dalton, who was sitting against a rock with his injured shoulder wrapped in a field bandage. Despite the blood on his sleeve, he was still talking, still alert. Dalton would be fine. Grant Walker helped him to his feet, while the others secured the perimeter around the landing zone. Within minutes, the wounded medic was lifted aboard the helicopter and strapped into a seat. The valley that had been filled with gunfire less than an hour earlier now looked almost peaceful. Sunlight rolled slowly across the ridges. Smoke from the destroyed convoy drifted upward like a fading memory. For a few minutes I stayed behind the rifle, scanning the cliffs to make sure no fighters returned, but the militants were gone. The moment their commander had fallen, the entire ambush had collapsed. Without the architect, the trap had no structure. Footsteps crunched across the rocks behind me. I turned slightly and saw Lieutenant Marcus Hale climbing the final stretch of the ridge toward our position. Even after everything that had happened, his movements were calm and controlled. That was the kind of leader he was. Hale stopped a few feet away and looked out across the valley for a moment before speaking. "Hell of a battlefield view from up here," he said quietly. I nodded. "Not the kind anyone wants to see." He glanced toward the distant ridge where the architect had been standing earlier. "That shot," he said after a moment. "Not a question, just recognition." I shrugged slightly. "Had the angle." Hale studied me for a second, then gave a small nod. "7 men walk out of that valley because of it. There wasn't anything to say back to that." A few minutes later, Grant Walker reached the ridge as well, carrying his rifle over one shoulder. He walked straight to the edge of the cliff and stared down the valley floor. Then he raised binoculars and looked toward the distant ridge where the shot had landed. "Distance?" he asked. My spotter answered. "Just under 2,000 meters." Grant lowered the binoculars slowly and shook his head. "2 clicks and shifting wind," he muttered. He looked back at me, half smiling. "Remind me not to challenge you at the range." But beneath the humor, there was something else in his expression. Understanding. Because every man on that team knew exactly how close the battle had come to ending differently. If that shot had missed, if the architect had given the order, the valley below us would have become a graveyard. The helicopters lifted off again a few minutes later, carrying the SEAL team back toward base. The sound of their rotors faded into the distance as the aircraft disappeared beyond the mountains. By the time we packed our gear and began descending from the ridge, the battlefield looked like any other empty stretch of rock and dust. No sign of the chaos that had filled it hours earlier. Later that night, during the mission debrief, the shot would be measured, documented, and written into the official report. Numbers would be recorded, distance calculated, wind conditions analyzed. It would become part of the record. But the truth of that moment wasn't about the rifle, and it wasn't about the distance. It was about the weight of a decision. Because in combat, there are moments when everything, every plan, every strategy, every life on the battlefield narrows down to one person making one choice: a steady breath, a calm mind, the discipline to trust your training when chaos surrounds you, and the courage to act when hesitation could cost lives. Sometimes war doesn't turn on entire armies. Sometimes it turns on a single moment, a single shot, and the responsibility of the soldier behind the rifle. Sometimes war comes down to a single moment, a steady breath, a clear mind, and the courage to take the shot when it matters most. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Lady Veteran Stories and tell me in the comments where are you watching from.